Hi, I'm Bob Johnson with SciFi Japan, and my partner Keith Aiken is with us today. And
Hello.
today we have a special guest. We're doing a special SciFi Japan TV episode, and we have Jeffrey Engels, who was the translator of this book. It's a novelization of Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again, and for the first time, it's been translated into English and is available for anyone to buy. And we'll get into that later on. Jeffrey, welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here talking with you guys today.
This is great. Yeah,
It's great to have you.
we both read the book, so we're ready to go.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
Keith, you got any questions?
I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about your background and how you got the assignment to do this translation.
Sure. So my name is Jeffrey Engels. I'm a professor of Japanese literature at Western Michigan University. There at Western, I teach Japanese language, Japanese literature, Japanese culture courses. It's a long, convoluted story about how I got this. But just to say a little bit more about myself, I do a lot of translation. I love to read. I love the Godzilla movies as a kid, and for the longest time in my career, that's kind of been on the back burner. That's just been sort of a private interest of mine. I spent a lot of my career working on literature of the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, especially the kind of popular literature that was being produced then. So I read a lot of the works that Kayama, the author who wrote these novelizations, and also wrote the screenplays for the first two movies. I read a lot of the literature that he was reading when he was growing up, and so on. So a few years ago, the way that I got this project. I was in Japan during the 2011 disasters, the earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima meltdown. And like everybody else in the country, I was completely overwhelmed by that experience, freaked out by it. And after I came back to America, I started to teach a new class about disaster in Japan, kind of as my own way of thinking through the disasters and the things that I'd seen and the things that Japan was going through, and in fact still is going through today with the meltdown. And in the course of doing that, in the course of teaching these classes about disaster, I decided to put Godzilla into the syllabus, the original 1954 movie. Because it's such a beautiful, deep meditation on the fears of radioactivity and nuclear weapons. I wanted students to think about that, and plus Godzilla was a fun and attractive thing. I have to admit that when I put Godzilla on the flyer for the class, students came en masse. So that
Oh,
was a good thing for me. But in the course of showing this, that first semester and subsequent semesters, I started paying attention to different things in the movie. And one of the things that I noticed that I hadn't really noticed during my childhood, love of Godzilla, was that there was this line in the credits that said Gensaku, the original work, Shigeru Kayama. And I was like, well, I hadn't paid any attention to that before, and I recognized Kayama as this important mid-century science fiction novelist. And so I thought, well, the stuff I've read about Godzilla really doesn't mention Kayama's involvement very much. So I went back and I started investigating, and that was when I discovered that his enormous role in the production of these movies, and then also it was a big discovery to me to realize that he had done a radio drama, or had been part of a radio drama that came out before Godzilla hit the theaters, and he produced these novelizations after the films came out. These novelizations were published in Japanese in 1955, so just about 2 months after the release of Godzilla Raids Again. So I was curious. The next time I went to Japan, I got a copy of the book. It turns out that the Japanese version is available very, very, very easily in every big bookstore, by an inexpensive paperback version published by Chikuma Shobo. And so I bought this. This is a wonderful book. It has these novelizations in it. It has the G project scenario that Kayama wrote for
Oh.
the film.
Mhm.
Um, and then it has a bunch of essays that Kayama wrote about his time working on Godzilla and his experiences. So I was like, wow, this is a treasure trove. Like, why do people in America not have this available? It just seemed crazy to me because, of course, I know that like film scholars, like wonderful people like Steve Reifel and Ed, whose last name I can't pronounce.
Gotcha.
Kozeski.
Yes, yes, they've done such wonderful work on the Godzilla films. William Tsutsui has done such wonderful work, but I felt like there was a part of the story yet that hadn't been entirely told. So, so I worked on the gods a little bit on the translation of the novellas. I sent them off to University of Minnesota Press, which I knew was doing a series of important Japanese science fiction writers in translation. And very much to my delight, University of Minnesota Press was like, yes, let's do this project. So I really, I've had a great time working with them, and they've been so supportive of the project that it's just been a complete delight from beginning to end. So sorry, that was a little bit long there.
No, it's fine.
I always love
That's,
detailed answers.
Yeah, great.
Did Toho have any involvement in any of the process, or was it kind of finish it and submit it?
Yeah, so it was a finish it and submit it kind of situation. My understanding is that Toho doesn't own the rights to Kayama's novelizations. Those were owned by somebody I think who was associated with his estate. I wasn't involved with the negotiations. The press did it, but yeah. So I think they worked with him. I had originally wanted to include the G Project scenario translations, the original scenario, because that's a fascinating thing, and it's quite different than the finalized version of the film that we see today. But Toho owns those rights, and so as a result, those couldn't become a part of this book. But hopefully another project for another day.
There you go. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting reading, if we take the first novella first on this Godzilla 1954.
Sure.
There seem to be a lot more differences between that and the final film than there were between Godzilla Raids Again and that film. And I think one big part was Shinkichi has a huge role in the novel, whereas in the movie, he's kind of put in the background behind like Ogata and Serizawa. But
that's
maybe
right.
talk a little bit about the differences, and did you have any reaction like during translating? Say, hey, this is better, worse, different, what have you?
Yeah, you're definitely right. That's the biggest difference between the 1954 film and this 1955 novelization. The character of Ogata, who is really the main protagonist, I think, of the 1954 film, he's kind of reduced to a somewhat secondary character in the novelization, and the Ogata's role as the kind of love interest of Emiko is transferred to Shinkichi in the novella. So you're definitely right that there's been a kind of shift of focus and who does what. I think that the reason that Kayama might have done this is because he was writing these 1955 novelizations for a young, probably adolescent audience. The novelizations of both Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again were published together in a single volume in mid 1955. In a book that was labeled like the first volume in a new series called Shonen Bunko, like Youth Library or Library for Adolescents. So it was clear, I mean, just from the way that the book is labeled, marketed, that Kayama was thinking that he wanted to sell this to a young adult audience and an audience that was probably largely male. So yeah, I think that has to do with, that's probably the main reason that he decided to refocus the attention on Shinkichi rather than Ogata in this book. Yeah, because, Shinkichi would be closer in age to the actual readers that he was envisioning.
Yeah, no,
interesting take. So,
I think that there's also, something else that's quite interesting about this because, in the film, when you have sort of Ogata and Serizawa kind of debating about, the ethics of science and, whether or not this weapon of mass destruction should be used, those are two characters who, in terms of age, are very close to, the people that would have lived through World War II, right? In fact, in the movie, Serizawa has this, big scar on his face that's never explained, but I think that practically every viewer in the year 1954 would have looked at that and thought, well, gosh, he's lived through World War II. Something probably bad happened to him during the war. Um, um, but in the novelization, there's kind of a generation gap between the character of, Serizawa and Shinkichi. And so, it's possible too that Kayama might have been making a statement about like the kind of different approach to science, that existed amongst different generations. Like, the wartime generation, like Serizawa, in the novella, just like in the film, he's waffling on whether or not he should use his weapon of mass destruction. This might get out and create damage for the rest of society. But Shinkichi in the novella has this very kind of clear notion. Of course, we have to use the oxygen destroyer. Of course, we have to save people. We have to put people first. That's very, very important. So I think that Kayama was kind of drawing in the novelization more than in the film, a kind of divide between the generations and their approach to kind of thinking about science and thinking about these things that could potentially have like big human consequences. Does that make sense? So
yeah.
I think there's So I think there's something really interesting going on in the novel that maybe doesn't happen quite as much in the film. So
Yeah, for those who
so
are
that's
kind of
one big
fuzzy on the
big
film
difference.
or haven't seen it in a while, Shinkichi is in the movie. He's he's like on Odo Island. His parents get killed, and he ends up living with Dr. Yamane. But at that point, he becomes definitely like a background character.
Right. Right. Exactly.
kind of tagging around with Ogata. That's kind of like,
That's
so,
right. Yeah. In the film, we see him. He's often wearing a big hat and
Right.
often wearing like a tank top. And this boy, he probably looks like the actor might have been about 13 or 14. I'm not sure exactly how old he was, but yeah.
I mean, he was there. He was just, he's not in the
Right.
forefront, so you just kind of have to look for him in the background in a lot of scenes.
was that
Right.
As you were translating and you're finding these differences? I imagine that was been like surprising or interesting, realizing you weren't just getting a straight take of the movie.
Right, right. And so of course that raised a lot of questions for me. So Kayama first worked on the screenplay, gave it to Toho. The people at Toho made all of their adjustments, which were quite extensive. They rewrote quite a bit of the Kayama scenario. But then since Kayama kind of came back to the story, I think it's the reason this novelization is so interesting to me is because it sort of represents a chance for Kayama to put his own spin on the story and maybe restore some things that he wanted to see in the story that Toho had kind of toned down or whatever. So I think the reason that this novelization is so incredibly interesting, maybe more interesting than a bunch of other novelizations that exist out there in the world of other movies, is that we get to kind of see how one of the original creators of Godzilla, arguably the father of Godzilla himself, envision this story, and what did he want to do with it? I think that comes through clearly here in the novel, where he doesn't have the forces of Toho Studios kind of suggesting to him how it should be changed. This is just purely him. So
I know with
lots of fun.
say with you hear that a lot with screenwriters, or they'll write a treatment, or they'll write a screenplay, then it's taken out of their hands, and what comes out is so different. So to have a chance to come back around after the fact and do another pass at it is rare, and it's a very interesting thing, particularly with this film of all films.
Right, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that's most was most striking to me is the opening of the novelization. For those of your fans who are out there and maybe really hardcore Godzilla fans, they probably all know this. So I'm sorry if this is just repeating stuff that's already common knowledge. But when Kayama wrote his G project scenario and gave it to Toho, at the beginning of it, there was this quite long voiceover that he had wanted to include in the film, which talked very directly to the audience, saying, there are these terrible things out there, nuclear weapons, which are being created, and really dangerous things, and these are the damage that they're causing to the world is so potentially catastrophic that we have to stand up. And he had suggested in the scenario that then there be some scenes of the boat that was radiated in 1954 in the Bikini Atoll Islands. We can talk about that later if people don't know. He wanted to include some other scenes from historical footage before kind of jumping into the story itself. And I think that, when he suggested including images of radioactive tuna that have been, exposed to atomic testing in the Pacific, and he wanted to show
earlier that year. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, definitely. That's something I hope we can talk about a little bit, because it's such an important thing in the genesis of the entire Godzilla franchise.
Oh yeah, I know in the back of the book, I mean, after the novels in the book, you have a whole section on the developing of the film and what happened with the script and how on and forth. But you were definitely saying that Kayama's original screenplay was really more of an allegory of the nuclear bomb and America and all that, and was kind of toned down by Honda and everybody for the film. But
that's right.
It was definitely, in fact, it even mentions the Lucky Dragon #5 and all that, which they kind of skirt around in the movie.
Yeah. Maybe I should mention that for readers who aren't or listeners who aren't familiar with that. Early in the year 1954, that was a time when the United States was busy developing hydrogen bombs. The Cold War was on. The Soviet Union and America were beginning to build up their nuclear arsenals. And so the U.S. was doing secret testing out in the Pacific, in what's now the Marshall Islands. In a place just outside an island called Bikini Atoll, they were testing these new weapons, which were many hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it turns out that a Japanese boat of fishermen, I think there were 23 fishermen on the boat, happened to be sailing around, in that area looking for tuna when they got irradiated by one of these nuclear tests. The name of the boat was the Lucky Dragon #5, Daigo Fukuryu Maru in Japanese. And it's a really ironic name because it wasn't a very lucky boat at all. But they so this boat was irradiated by the tests, and they sailed back to Japan. The boat was terribly radioactive. One of the crew members, a fellow by the name of Kuboyama, is that right? Died within the year, and then the rest came down with illnesses and so on. So this became a huge incident in Japan. It was on front page newspapers, every day for a long time. There was a subsequent investigation by the Japanese government, which discovered that the fish that they brought back, and many of the fish that were brought back by other fishermen out there in the Pacific, were showing signs of radiation. So that caused a panic about radioactive tuna all throughout Japan, and that was again front page news. So this incident in the beginning of 1954 was sometimes labeled by Japanese critics as the third time that Japan was bombed by the United States. The first one being Hiroshima, second being Nagasaki, the third being this boat. So it was a huge incident. It was on the minds of everybody. That same year, 1954, very soon after this incident took place, the producer from Toho Studios, Tomoyuki Tanaka, happened to be in Indonesia, and the project that he was working on fell through. And so he found himself without a project. He was fretting like, oh no, what do I do? I promised Toho Studios a movie this year. Oh no. And he got on the plane from Indonesia back to Japan, and he was reading a trade magazine, and it happened to mention there's an article in there, I guess, about the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, the American movie, which was from 1953. And he's like, oh gosh, I wonder if we could make a movie about radiation here, a big monster movie. And he, I think, kind of came on up with the clever idea of doing this, partly because this was still in the news at the time. This disaster with a fishing boat. So he turned over the idea that he had kind of passed around the studios to Kayama, who was a kind of up and coming, or actually I shouldn't say up and coming. He was already kind of arrived. He was at that time a very hot, not brand new young sci-fi writer, and said, "Hey, write me something about a radioactive monster." And it was Kayama who basically kind of came up with the contours of the Godzilla story that we all know and love today. So Kayama really kind of seized upon the opportunity, wanted to kind of turn this into a protest film. But as I started to say earlier, when he turned that scenario over to the people at Toho Studios, we're like, whoa, dude, way too heavy-handed here. So they kind of toned it down. In the very beginning, if we watch the 1954 movie carefully, we'll see that the very first kind of hint that we have of Godzilla's appearance is a boat that's there in the sea, and it blows up mysteriously in the water. And if you pay attention, the number 5 is written there on the boat. So there is a subtle reference for 1954 moviegoers that would kind of tie this back to historical events, but it's not heavy-handed in the way that Kayama originally envisioned it. I mentioned this all because in the novellas, one of the things that I found so interesting is kind of like this, cultural historian and literary historian, is that Kayama, when he starts out the book, he's restored a statement about nuclear weapons. And is it okay if I just read that one passage from the book?
Yeah,
because
just
I think it's really, really telling. I'm sorry if I'm talking too much here. I just
no.
I got all nerdy and excited.
You're in good company.
Oh, great! Yay! I hope all the listeners out there are forgiving too. But so this is how Kayama starts the novelization. Right in front of it, he's got this kind of author's preface, which says this: "As you readers already know, the main character of this tale, Godzilla, is an enormous imaginary kaiju, a creature that doesn't actually exist anywhere here on the planet. However, atomic and hydrogen bombs, which have taken on the form of Godzilla in this story, do exist. They are being produced and could be used for war at any moment. If that were to happen, it wouldn't just be the big metropolises like Tokyo and Osaka that would be destroyed. The entire Earth would likely be laid waste. To prevent something so frightening and tragic from coming to pass, people all over the world are pouring out their energy into a new movement opposing the use of atomic and hydrogen bombs. As one small member of that movement, I've tried to do my part by writing a novel, the tale that you now hold in your hands. Reading this book in that context will make it all the more informative and interesting." And then he signs it July 1955. So we can see here that, like, in the novellas, Kayama's taken the anti-nuclear message that he really had felt was very important in the films, but that got toned down by Toho Studios, and he's restoring it for the novellas. So I found that really interesting.
I'll say, in your notes at the back of the book, one of the things that I really enjoyed reading was how Kayama saw the character evolving very quickly from what he envisioned as a very strong anti-nuclear message to being kind of a pop culture character. And now he decided he wouldn't write Godzilla again because, what was the line? "I'm starting to like the character too much." And it was
That's
getting
right.
away from, I thought it was just that quickly. He was noticing it that soon.
Right.
Look at the character now, and and it goes through where it kind of comes back around to the allegory.
Right.
Looks like Godzilla -0 might be getting, or -1, excuse me, might be getting back towards that kind of thing. But you've got the 70s films, and the 60s films are much more lighthearted. So it was interesting to hear.
Right.
So I'm glad you shared that.
Great.
Too. Thank you. So
Thank you. Yes. So to flesh that out a little bit, when Godzilla was a huge success. And Kayama did like the 1954 movie by all accounts. It said that when he first saw the movie, he burst into tears at a private screening. Then when they had their first public screening, he again burst into tears in front of everybody because he was so moved by the entire story. So, he seems to have been on board and okay with the changes. However, Godzilla was such a big success that very quickly, I think already as soon as January of 1955, people were, at the studio started talking about, well, a sequel. And so they came back to Kayama, and they said, hey, will you write a sequel for us? And he was like, his first reaction was apparently, what are you talking about? We killed Godzilla at the end of the first movie. How on earth can we bring him back? For hardcore movie lovers, they know that at the end of the film, the oxygen destroyer is used. We see bubbling in the water. Then suddenly we see Godzilla, struggling. Then a moment later, we see his bones. And then even a moment later, those bones have dissolved away into nothingness. So how can you bring back a monster that's been dissolved away into nothingness?
Nothing, yeah.
Yeah, so Kayama, he seized upon Yamane's statements at the end of the first film. The film ends with Yamane saying, we humans have to be careful. If we keep on doing things like this kind of horrible nuclear testing, a second Godzilla might appear one day. Or he said something to that effect. That's not an exact quote, obviously. But yeah, so Kayama decided to use this and bring back not the same Godzilla that was killed, but another member of his species in the second movie. And then at the end of the second movie, he killed him again, by covering him in a maybe he killed him or maybe just froze him. I don't know, but he covered him in an avalanche of ice at the end of the second film. So I think Kayama already had so much kind of trouble thinking about, like, is this hokey if we bring him back, for the second movie? I think he kind of didn't want to do that again. And then there was also this very interesting thing that happened to him in 1955 after the second film came out. He was going in a dentist office. He wrote about this in an essay. He went to a dentist office, and there happened to be a Life magazine that was lying there. And there were some pictures of dinosaurs in it. And like a little kid who happened to be there in the waiting room was looking at it and got all excited and said, oh, Godzilla, this is Godzilla. And he suddenly realized that, like, people love Godzilla. People like young viewers are feeling a special kind of affection, especially after the second movie, which kind of was more about like battles between monsters than really the allegorical meaning of Godzilla that he had started with. So I think based on that experience, Kayama says that he decided that he wasn't going to write any more films because his original purpose of using Godzilla as a stand-in for nuclear weapons, for the fear of nuclear weapons, had already started to morph into something different by the second film. And so his original goal of using this as a vehicle for protest and maybe even social change was kind of falling by the wayside. So he wrote in that essay, no matter how much the studio executives come and beg me to do it, I'm never going to write another Godzilla again. So that was the end of his involvement with the Godzilla franchise.
It might have been interesting to see what it would have been like if he did continue, because the next movie was totally different. And the next was like King Kong versus Godzilla, and everything changed at that point. But
right,
you kind of wonder if Kayama had continued on, what direction Godzilla would have taken.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, were there novelizations for the subsequent films, or?
To the best of my knowledge, I don't know of any novelizations that were done by famous writers. There may have been some done. I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that, but there's certainly none that stood out by famous writers. Yeah, the only other one that I know of that has a book that's really closely associated with a film is Mothra. But Mothra was based on a book. So there was a book first, and that was turned into Mothra. And the name of the book was Hakoyose to Mosura in Japanese, The Luminous Fairies and Mothra. and it was written jointly by three very famous writers of the mid-century. People who were not so famous for involvement in science fiction, but who were kind of more known as sort of high lit kind of authors, not genre fiction kind of authors.
Mhm.
So yeah, I after I did this project, a number of people have written to University of Minnesota Press and said, "This is great. We love these novelizations. When are you going to do Mothra next?" So I don't know. This is something that we're thinking about,
I don't
and so
know. I
we're
mean, that's one of my
investigating.
favorite non-Godzilla Toho films.
Yeah,
Mothra, but yeah,
interesting.
I think this book comes out on November 3rd, I believe, and
October 3rd. Yeah.
I think fans are really going to enjoy it. So
Oh,
I could
thank you.
see some kind of sequel, quote unquote, coming out of it,
I'd
whether
I'd
that be
love to do
Mothra
it.
or something else. But
I don't know how good the book is, but I would be very interested in seeing a translation of the novelization of the radio drama.
Oh, right. That would be really interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah. So Kayama, my understanding is that that Kayama wasn't super directly involved in the novelization. There is the novelization, the radio drama was broadcast from July to I think September of 1954. So just before the film came out, it was broadcast in 11 installments on Ippon Hoso, which is like a national radio broadcast at the time.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I think that helped to kind of get some excitement in the air for the film when it came out. But it is really quite different, and there's a lot of things that I think that the moviegoers would be quite surprised by.
That's the thing, because
Uh,
these alternate takes on a story that we all know so well, I think,
yeah,
are of a lot of interest. And I definitely would be up for Mothra too. Don't get me wrong on that.
because
right on.
just thinking
we just
about reading this,
Uh-huh.
um, Godzilla, the novelization was so different from the movie
Hmm.
that it really kept my attention. Whereas
Oh, good.
Godzilla Raids Again is so similar to the movie that while reading it, I keep thinking of scenes from the movie and the actors or whatever. Whereas Godzilla, I could kind of isolate it as its own story.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
when
yeah.
you were doing the translations, did the movies have any kind of influence over those, or were you able to just kind of keep blinders on and translate
No,
the novel?
so I think the statement that you just made is very astute. There are scenes in the second novelization, Godzilla Raids Again, where you like there's scenes in the movie where you see Godzilla and the other monster there kind of fighting in front of Osaka Castle with the castle rising in the background. And when Kayama has written those scenes here in the novelization, he describes it just like he's watching the film and kind of
Mhm.
describing it. Like he describes Osaka Castle rising in the background above them, and so it's like he's even envisioning his narrator being like at the same angle as in the film. So there's a lot of the film and the novelization of Godzilla Raids Again are very close. Um, as you said, like,
Yeah.
especially when compared to Godzilla 1954 and the novelization here. Um, so yeah. And I think that had to do with the fact that like, it was the second movie was brand new, at the time that
Mhm.
these novelizations were being written. I'm not even sure at what point or what month he might have started writing a novelization, that he might have even been doing that while the movie was, being filmed and so on. So I think that had something to do with it. By the second film, in other words, like he was already kind of thinking of it more as a movie than he was as like a kind of story that got turned into a movie.
And as soon as the first movie came out, Toho was very quick to push the sequel through and get that going. So I'm sure that was
Right.
not the time allotted that he had in the first film. Yeah, it was just,
Right.
here we go, we're doing a sequel. It's coming out, because it came out the
Well,
following year. So
yeah. No, I mean, it's one of the things that I think that's so incredible to me about these first Godzilla movies is the unbelievably quick turnaround.
uh,
The main idea for the story came in like, like they hired Kayama in May of 1954 to work on this scenario for them, and the film was out by by the end of the
November.
year, like November,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think November 3rd maybe, or something like that. It was towards the beginning of the month, and so that's not much time, especially for like a film that's become so incredibly important and iconic. Like
Sure.
that's only half a year. Unbelievable.
Yeah, it just tells you the talent of the people involved to make something that's endured. It's such a short amount of time.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, if you look at Mothra versus Godzilla and Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, they both came out in the same year. They both came out in
Wow.
64. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a testament to how hardworking people were there at Toho.
Yeah, they were a factory by the mid-60s. They were just
Right.
the quality was there, but they were just putting stuff out really fast. It was amazing.
Right.
Have you gotten any feedback on the book from anyone in Japan or Toho?
So not specifically from anybody at Toho. I'd love to hear it. I'm hoping that maybe they'll carry it in their online store. I don't know, but yeah, it's been interesting. I've been seeing the early reviews begin to trickle in on kind of social media and like on Goodreads on
Right.
on the net. And it's really interesting I think a lot of people found the story engaging. Some people I think were surprised to realize that this was written for a young adult audience. So it wasn't it's perhaps not as elaborate as some adult novels might be, but I think a lot of people really enjoyed it, and so I've been seeing good things. There was a couple of people commented in the reviews that oh, the dialogue seems a little bit dated in places, and I thought, well, good. It was written 70 years ago, so if it seemed like it happened in the 21st century, then that would be kind of a mistranslation. So
yeah.
yeah.
Were you ever tempted to change a sentence or two to make it more contemporary, or you wanted to stick to the flavor of the time? And
I did my best to try to capture the feeling of the time. Of course, I'm a child of the 21st century, and so my late 20th and 21st century, and so my language is all formed now as opposed to then. So it's possible that some anachronisms crept in, but I did try to think about what language people might have been using at the time and reflect that a little bit. One thing actually where that comes through, and excuse me again for getting all nerdy about this stuff,
that's
but
fine.
in the course of this book, there's a lot of government agencies are introduced. This group became involved, this group became involved, this group became involved, and at first I just went in and I looked at the names of those organizations in how they're translated today. Like there's and so like, but then I showed it to a colleague of mine who's quite well versed in Godzilla, and he commented. He said, oh, the name of the Japanese Coast Guard wasn't the Coast Guard in 1950s. Actually, that's a very new translation for the word Coast Guard. So I had to go back and I had to look up the official translation of the thing that's now called the Coast Guard in 1955, and so I tried to reflect the language, even in those kind of subtle ways. Readers probably won't pay a lot of attention to those kind of things, but I really tried hard to get it right as best I could. But that being said, there were places where I had to make adjustments. English and Japanese are very different languages. And the most dramatic place where I had to make an adjustment was in talking about the monster themselves, himself, herself. The reason I say this is because there's no hint anywhere in the book, in a novella, anywhere at all, whether anything about the sex or gender of Godzilla. It's unclear if Godzilla is a he, a she, or hermaphroditic, creature, or non-conforming in some way. And so that left me with a kind of difficult problem, like what pronoun should I use to talk about Godzilla?
That's basically.
So I started using it thinking, well, I want to kind of keep it gender neutral. And when I showed the first draft to my students at Western Michigan University, they were like, what? This is too distancing. I think they had always thought of Godzilla as male, and they were like, it's not personal enough if Godzilla is always being called it everywhere. In Japanese, it's very easy, by the way, to avoid pronouns. You don't ever have to use a pronoun if you don't want to. There are other ways of making it clear what you're talking about through context. And in Japanese, for instance, the words raised paw or raised hand would be a perfectly good and complete sentence in and of itself, if you know that you're talking about Godzilla. But in English, we have to say Godzilla raised his hand, and so we have to kind of insert something in there in a couple of different places, and I found that really challenging because I couldn't figure out a way to kind of do that and make it sounded so distancing. I also tried they in the kind of contemporary usage to mean kind of a non-gender conforming individual, but when I used they, it got very confusing very quickly, because there are lots of scenes in which Godzilla is interacting with people, and if I use they, then it became sometimes it sometimes became unclear if I was talking about the people he's interacting with or attacking or Godzilla. So in the end, I kind of made peace with the idea of using the pronoun he, and my logic was that if Kayama wanted to think about Godzilla as a stand-in for the nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons were designed by the American military, Robert Oppenheimer and his crew, and the American military is largely dominated by men, a very patriarchal institution. Maybe it's okay if, Godzilla is a he. So
that's why king of the monsters, right? So
Joe embraced that pretty quickly. And if you go back, I don't know if you've seen there is like English advertising material produced by Toho to promote the early films overseas. And they would use he and things like that. When they did like King Kong versus Godzilla, they had little speeches written by each monster. And like Kong is going, I'm looking forward to challenging Mr. Godzilla for the crown. It's like
Mr. Godzilla.
It was things like that. So they seem like they went with a male kind of designation fairly early on. But you're right, it's not clearly said in the films. Maybe Son of Godzilla. I think they refer to Godzilla as a proud papa or something at one point. It's like there's things like that. But yeah, I could see in an early translation, you're like, I'm not sure what Kayama.
I think the only one they really paid attention to the gender on was Mothra, because Mothra was always she, but then when the two caterpillars, supposedly one was a he, one was a she, and so it kind of changed here and there, but I think to this day they pretty much refer to Mothra as a she.
I've read the novel that Mothra is based on. I've got it in the other room there, and I don't remember like what pronouns were used, if any, there. This if I get the opportunity to work on Mothra, I think I'll have to think about this all over again.
Do it.
But
Mothra was more kind of like a mother deity to the fairies too, so I think that influenced the gender as well.
Right. By the way, in the novel, there are not two fairies, but there are four of them, and so I'm not quite clear what the logic was to reduce that to two. Maybe that was just because they got this group of well-known actresses to play. But
I understand
twins are very rare in Japan, so I'm sure quintuplets are probably unheard of, but.
Sure.
You got the Peanuts and what was the other one? Pear Bambi.
Yeah. So I imagine trying to film the Peanuts twice for every scene would have been, to get the quartet would have been, just a logistical nightmare on top of making them tiny and But
you got to think though, those twin fairies are so iconic now in the film.
Right.
It's like whatever they did it right.
Yeah, it's been interesting for me to see how many people like really love Mothra. And when I've been having this
Mhm.
discussion about like, well, I'm kind of interested in the Mothra book next. I've had all these friends say, "Oh my God, that's my favorite of all the sequels. That's my favorite of all the kaiju films." I've been surprised at how many people have said that to me. So I
Well, if
love
they
it.
had if they have novelizations of Godzilla, Godzilla Rays Again, and Mothra, I mean, Rodan was like right in the middle of that. There was no
Mm,
novelization for that.
not to the best of my knowledge. Yeah.
You did mention, right? Kayama did do one more treatment for Toho. Was it for Mysterians? Was there something
Um,
else?
so he worked on a couple of other films in different capacities. He worked on the Mysterians a
Mhm.
bit, and he worked there he was working to help develop an already existing story into a screenplay. So I think it was more of a, and he wasn't creating from scratch in that situation. The other one that he worked on was called, I think in English was called Half Human.
Ah,
Oh, yeah.
Snowman movie. Okay.
Yes, that's right, that's right. So that was also based on a work of his. So in the volume of the complete works of Kayama, which
Mhm.
is a huge thing, it
Mhm.
takes up like an entire bookshelf here. It's this big. In the same volume that contains Godzilla, it contains that the original for that
Human. So,
the Snowman story. Yeah,
Yeah.
Half Human.
So, being that there are so many different volumes for Kayama, what kind of other stories did he write that may not have been film related? What was he
Yeah,
mostly known for?
so he really was interested in paleontology. He was really interested in animals. He was really interested in the things that people don't know about. In fact, his very first debut story, which was published in 1947, if I'm remembering correctly,
Mhm.
um, was a story about the discovery of a kind of ape-like creature in the South Pacific that had been not known about by human beings, but then discovered by human beings in the course of their kind of attacks on the environment. So this is like something that sounds actually a lot like Godzilla.
mhm.
So it's really interesting to me that like there in his debut story, which won him a lot of attention, there's already some Godzilla-like themes. Um, yeah, he was really fascinated with like the parts of the natural world that we aren't able to see from time in our everyday lives.
Obviously, what Tanaka saw, huh, when he reached out to him to work on Godzilla.
Right. Yeah, I should mention too that the his a lot of his early work was published in a magazine called Hoseki, or I think it's usually translated as the Jewel or Jewels.
Mhm.
Um, Hoseki was a important magazine in the post-war period for promoting like stories of adventure, mystery stories, detective stories, crime fiction, and other kinds of popular genre fiction. And so a lot of the stories that appear in Hoseki and Kayama's included kind of blur a lot of these genres. I think we tend to think of like adventure stories and detective stories as kind of separate things nowadays, but there was a lot of kind of overlap, and arguably there still is. But yeah, so like a lot of these kind of boy adventure stories had elements of ratiocination, where people are tracking down a criminal or something like that. So Kayama stories tend to involve like a lot of these different elements. There's sort of detective stories, sort of mystery stories, sort of adventure stories, and that's what makes them so fun.
Well,
Is that what
maybe
led to the?
Minnesota Press would be interested in a series of Kayama stories or books.
I think that'd be a lot of fun. He's written some really good things, and it would be a great delight to bring some of those to an English audience.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, it'd be fun. Like it's kind of like going back and reading Bradbury stories from the 40s and 50s. And
Right,
see the
right.
different perspective and how things
mhm.
were handled time. Did his like detective type things, was that what influenced the Godzilla Society in the novella?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I exactly have the answer. For people who haven't read the book yet, let me just mention that one of the strangest editions that doesn't appear in the 1954 film is a something called the Tokyo Godzilla Society, or Tokyo Gojira-dan in Japanese. And what happens is that the characters, as Tokyo is being stomped upon by Godzilla, in the aftermath of that, suddenly flyers start appearing throughout the city, like saying, bow down before our new god, Godzilla, and if you don't, then terrible things will happen to you. And this appears in the news. There's some threatening letters sent to some important figures, all signed by the Tokyo Godzilla Society. And when I read this, I was like, "What? Where did this come from? This is so out of left field, you know?" And I, I, and then after another visit by Godzilla to Tokyo, they find a guy who's been smushed in the rubble of a building, who's got a bag filled with like these posters, and it was clear that he was posting them around Tokyo. And it turns out that he was a criminal who had a record of like extorting money from people. And so that was the end of the Tokyo Godzilla Society. And it's a little bit unclear why Kayama stuck this in there.
So he was,
and I thought about it a lot, but
yeah,
yeah, right. So it was this one guy who was the Tokyo Godzilla Society, and
sounds like a cool group. Sounds like something we'd be a part of. Yeah.
Yeah. So but like as I was thinking about it, I realized that there is a like in the movie King Kong, the original King Kong, there are, which of course is like kind of like arguably like the granddaddy of all kaiju movies.
Yeah.
He there's like a group of natives on the island that worship Godzilla like a god, and so I wonder if Kayama was remembering that. It's possible too that Kayama might have been using this as little itty bitty subplot as a way to kind of remind people that in times of disaster there will be unscrupulous people that do nasty things. Certainly anybody who lived through World War II would know that.
Right.
In the post-war period, it was 1946, 1947, 1948. Everybody went to get their food at the black markets. And so, it's really through like unscrupulous people and people doing unscrupulous things that a lot of people just survived, So anyone in 1954 would have remembered, that there were people that do unscrupulous things in times of disaster.
Yeah.
Also, too, I like to think about like how things are connected. So I remember the iconic anime based on the manga Akira, and there's and there too there's like a cult that that comes up and begins to worship Akira, and so that message of like the cult worshiping the monster, it appears so often in these across this kind of kaiju or kaiju adjacent genre that doesn't seem like a coincidence.
Yeah. So I think there's like a throwaway line in Shin Godzilla. I think something where people say Godzilla's God or something to that effect. And the whole idea, I guess, for this thing just shows up that's so unbelievable, and I totally remember the scene in Akira too with when is it Tetsuo that gets the powers later on, and he's going across the bridge and he's got the crowd following him who've been waiting for the return of Akira. That
I think that's right.
And
it crosses over in other films too. I mean, look at like Independence Day.
Yeah.
All the people on top of the building, welcoming the invader. We welcome you in peace, and they get all blown up. But
right,
it's an interesting concept. Yeah, I do wish it had been fleshed out more in the original story, but it'd be nice to see something that maybe a future Godzilla film picks up and kind of runs with the idea of this like I said, something that's almost like a godlike being, and just how certain people begin to form a cult around it.
Well, it's even like in Godzilla Raids Again, which I've always found kind of weird, and I was surprised that it was actually in the novelization, is the whole kind of little brief subplot of the prisoners that escape.
Right.
It's like in the movie, it just seems like that's kind of odd and thrown in there out of nowhere. And It's like they escape, and then a few scenes later, they're crushed, and that's the end of it. But it was actually in the novelization, so I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, yeah, that was quirky. Yeah, I agree with you that it feels like something that's of a little bit of a different kind of nature than the rest of the story.
Yeah.
Um,
I was just
I
thinking
know
as
that to
just
advance.
say a rationale just to
Go
cause
ahead.
the fire that brings the monster.
Right, right,
It's like just a
right.
real quick with not a lot of thought.
That's what I was gonna say.
Rationale.
Yeah, yeah. I think right, right. I think probably I'm guessing that that the rationale for including them was because any kind of good-natured person wouldn't light a fire when they knew that it might cause Godzilla to attack. So by putting that act in the hands of some criminals who are running away from the police, then it suddenly becomes all understandable or justifiable or something. I don't know, but yeah,
It's just
yeah,
one of those, it almost seems like a crazy throw-in, like the end of War of the
yeah.
Gargantuas. They're fighting there and in the water, and then suddenly, oh, here's a volcano, and they're destroyed. But
Yeah. We
out
gotta
of
wrap this
nowhere.
up.
Wow.
But,
When you were doing the translation, I know like one of the things I kind of caught my eye was that Godzilla emitted a faint like glow in the dark, and I
Yeah,
thought that was really
yeah.
interesting. And were there any other things? I mean, I guess you would have included them, but in either Kayama's notes or as you were translating, any other attributes of the monster that were unique to the novellas?
Um, I well, I think for the most part, the descriptions of the monster seem to conform fairly closely to what we see in the films. Uh, and I imagine that would partly be because if it were to differ too radically from the films, then people might be like, what?
Oh, yeah.
This isn't the Godzilla we know and love.
what is that?
And they might be yeah, you're right, yeah, to be like, what's that? Yeah, irritated. But there were moments in the 1954 film where we do see kind of the outline of Godzilla beginning to glow a bit.
Yeah.
So I think it's not unjustified in the novella, the bluish glow.
Oh, I do remember you also had Anguirus doing a radioactive ray, same as Godzilla. That was it.
Yeah.
Which obviously he
Yes,
hasn't done before. Yeah.
that's right. Yeah, that's true. I don't remember that being in the film. Was it
No,
there?
it's not.
Yeah,
Yeah, no,
right. Yeah.
he has no weapon at all. But in the
He's just a tooth
novella
and claw.
also, Anguirus is like really quick and nimble and
Uh-huh.
ferocious. And I
Yeah,
know
very
they
aggressive.
mentioned a little bit about that in the film when they mentioned that his brains are spread throughout his thorax and that. But
Right. Yeah, yeah.
I figure, yeah, well, rubber suits, he can't be too nimble and too quick or whatever. But
Yeah, especially with
that
the
was
big shell-like thing on the
Yeah.
back.
yeah,
I think that probably would inhibit a lot of movement.
right. But I was surprised though that he had a ray as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. That's true. When I translated that part, I did think, wait, was that in the movie? And yeah,
Yeah,
I had to go back to rewatch it.
yeah. But yeah, I went back. I actually watched the movie last night just because I
Oh,
hadn't seen it
great.
in a while. And
Uh-huh.
yeah, no, I was just struck by how similar it was to that novella.
Oh, neat, neat. Yeah,
So
yeah.
for like the
I
process, how long did it take you to do the translations?
So I worked on them a little bit at a time. I the second one went a lot faster than the first one, and the reason for that partly was because the I was just so motivated with the first one to get everything right. I spent a lot of time like researching. When he referred to songs or referred to like little itty bitty things, I would try to find out about them. One of the interesting things, by the way, and maybe I'm going off on the tangent a bit, um, was that like in the movie and in the movies, the monsters, the kaiju, step on so many different things. When Godzilla comes to Tokyo, he tramples on tons of different buildings, and certain ones are iconic and certain ones stand out in the film, like the Japanese Diet Building, the bridge, and some other things, the clock tower. But in the novel, like Kayama really focuses on particular buildings, the destruction of this bridge, the destruction of the Japanese Diet building, and so it was really interesting to me to kind of like pay attention to what Kayama felt it was important to have Godzilla destroyed in particular, and it made me think like, well, why this building in particular? Why that building in particular? And so I spent a lot of time kind of nerding out, like like looking into the history of each of these buildings and trying to figure out what they might have represented to moviegoers in 1954. So that was one thing that like I didn't really have to do very much with the second film because the second novelization, because in the Godzilla Raids Again Porsche novelization here, we the destruction of Osaka Castle and the buildings just immediately adjacent to that. But for the most part, the descriptions of the destruction in Osaka aren't that tied to specific famous buildings. It's kind of like like trampling along the seashore and the warehouses there and stuff like that. They're just kind of like generic warehouses. But yeah, so like the Tokyo portion in the first Godzilla novelization was involved much more specific like description of place. And so as I was translating, I got up my Google Maps. I was like looking at like, okay, oh, how far is this from that? And
did you notice that he followed a
blast.
specific route as he was going through Tokyo? Was there maybe
Yeah,
something he was trying to do there?
so Kayama did mention a number of specific places. It was clear that he wanted to have Godzilla hit like the neighborhood of the Ginza, which is like kind of one of the very upscale, very modern places. It was the site of some of Japan's first department stores. It was the site of like one of the major PX places during the occupation period, where the soldiers would go to get all their goods. So so that location was the glittering kind of center of Tokyo in 1950, and had been for a couple of decades already. So I think that by like having him destroy that particular area, he was sort of symbolically destroying the whole kind of post-war order of that had supported the Japanese nation. He was striking at the economic heart of Japan in a way. But like so like going to and from the Ginza, seemed to have been kind of like the major part of his route. So a lot of the locations are kind of either in or out, or maybe just a little bit beyond the Ginza.
That's cool. It looks like they actually give it that much thought, and the fact that you recognized it,
Yeah.
I know as the film series went on, it was like nowadays it's almost an honor for Godzilla to destroy your building in a movie or what have you. It's like
that's neat. Yeah.
But back then it was totally new to everyone.
One of the things that I was especially tickled about in this is that so in the movie 1954 Godzilla, the first one, Godzilla stomps upon the Japanese Diet, which is kind of like the equivalent of Parliament, or like the U.S. Congress is where the government meets to do stuff. But in that scene, if you watch it really carefully, like Godzilla's kind of walking towards the Japanese, the Japanese Diet, and then like right at that moment, he's about to step on it, he kind of begins to turn to the side just a little bit, and then like he's just about to miss it. It kind of looks like he's just stepping right out of the way. And then in the next shot, we see Godzilla's foot crumpling some white buildings. And it's a little bit unclear. Like, so some scholars, there's one scholar who kind of surmise that perhaps Godzilla was stepping away from the Japanese Diet building, and the white walls that we see crumbling were not actually the Japanese Diet building, and he spilled a lot of ink talking about this, but the novel makes it perfectly clear that he was stepping on the Japanese Diet. And I read somewhere in like someone's memoirs that what happened in that scene was that just as the actor was about to step on the Diet building, he kind of got lost in the suit a little bit, and so that's the reason for the the slight movement away that is quickly cut off by the editor. Yeah. Anyway, so
I gotta say, when we do our Godzilla Fest every year, there's two films that we almost always include and almost always sell out, and that's Godzilla 54 and Shin Godzilla.
Wow.
So, yeah, Godzilla
Interesting.
54, we kicked it off this year with that. And yeah, that's always one of the most popular films that we show.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to me that those two are in particular are so popular. I mean, yeah, they're both, I mean, really important films, but they're, of the entire Godzilla franchise, they're two of the most kind of politically, culturally astute of the films. Like Godzilla was definitely trying to make a message. It was sending a very important message to moviegoers in 1954. It was a really important film for a lot of people. Like lots of people wept in their seats, remembering their own experiences in World War II as they were seeing these scenes of Godzilla go through, and it was really cathartic for the Japanese population. And then also Shin Godzilla, coming so soon on the heels of the Fukushima meltdown. I mean, it's in many ways directly referencing things that were happening there. Like there are scenes like. I was really struck, like being in Japan at the time, I was like glued to the TV coverage about the as the prime minister was coming on like all the time and announcing what was happening at Fukushima. And I remember the press conference when, he was saying something, and then someone ran out to him and said, oh, what you said, whispered in his ear and said, oh, what you said was not true. That actually, and that is like, is shown that like that scene verbatim in Shin Godzilla. So, it's very clear that like Shin Godzilla was partially like one of its purposes in a way was to criticize the Japanese government for its handling of information and after Fukushima. Like it points out that the Japanese government was just not up to the task of dealing with a disaster on that large of a scale. New kinds of thinking are necessary. That's the movie seems to suggest. And my point is that like both the 54 and the Shin Godzilla are really kind of politically engaged movies in a way that maybe not all the other ones are. Definitely some of the other ones had political messages. Definitely some of them had environmentalist messages. But I think those two are especially biting in their message.
Well, I mean, I would think a lot of the films obviously don't have a message other than monsters are fighting monsters, but I think those two, Godzilla versus Hedorah, I mean, those are that really kind of push a message across. And it's amazing that this film made back in 1954 retains that message today, and it's not like diluted, because obviously when it came out in 54 it was only like 9 years after Japan was bombed, and everything was really fresh. There's that one scene with the woman and her two children, and she's saying, we're about to go and join your father. Like it seems like a throwaway line, but if you really think about it, that he probably died in the bombings or died in the war or what have you. But, so the fact that it retains that impact to today is just an amazing testament to the film.
I 100% agree. And as I was working on this, I mean, I began to think about how Godzilla is in a way kind of a perfect message, or like a perfect vehicle for us to kind of talk about climate change nowadays. Like the whole story of Godzilla is about humans wounding the environment, and the environment coming and biting us in the ass. And and of course that's like the entire story of the Anthropocene, this kind of moment in geological history that we are in, where humans are affecting the world and the world is coming back to punish us. So it struck me that like Godzilla is the perfect symbol for like our kind of moment in we're thinking about the climate and our relationship to it in profoundly new ways.
Oh, definitely. And if you look at some of the other older films, I mean, Rodan starts off talking about the hydrogen bomb and all that, and Mothra is more about greed and that type of exploitation of
colonialism. Yeah, I was watching Hedora the other day,
Uh,
and I think what was that, 1971?
Yeah, everyone. Yeah.
Is that right? Okay. Yeah, and it struck me. I hadn't remembered this, but you know, like the monster there is, of course, like this big sludgy thing that comes out of the sea, and you know, he like to me watching it now, it was so obvious to me like that's an allegory for the Minamata industrial accident that happened in the 1960s in Japan, and that was like front page news, you know, throughout like, you know, much of the 1960s. And in southern Japan, there was in a place called Minamata, people started showing up with this weird disease. People started getting really shaky, and they began to lose their ability to speak, and then people began to die. It affected thousands of people, and you know, the numbers of people who died from this disease were shockingly high. But it turns out after investigation that the cause of this was one company that was dumping mercury laden sludge into the Ariake Sea, and so the
Right.
fishermen were like eating the fish that had consumed the mercury, and so they were getting mercury poisoning and dying. And so, like, you know, it's so clear to me that like Hedera was an allegory for this story. And there's a moment where there's like sludge kind of pouring down some stairs, and there's a cat sitting in it, kind
oh,
of
yeah.
like shaking and meowing. And in the subsequent research about the history of Minamata disease, they discovered that the cats were like the first figures in which this disease showed up. And so cats figured, you know, really prominently in the story of Minamata, and you know, the industrial pollution there. So like it was really interesting to
Yeah.
me like how Toho reflected upon this in such an interesting and thoughtful way. But you know, I hadn't recognized that when I saw that movie for the first time
Well, yeah, you just
years and
think the
years
cat
ago.
is just kind of there for effect, but
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
the fact that there is a
Yeah.
whole backstory on the cats makes
Yeah.
it interesting. That was all Yoshimitsu Banno, I guess.
Right.
That,
Right.
I'd love to see
Yeah.
more of your research on that, just because, you know, you could make the obvious connection that it's an anti-pollution film.
Mhm.
And
Right.
growing up as a child in the 70s, I remember, you know, the crying Indian commercials
right.
and the real
Right.
push. I remember there being much more trash on the sides of the roads growing up than you see nowadays. And then, you know, that movement worked to some degree. And I always kind of put Hedera in that part of that worldwide anti-pollution movement, as not connected to a specific incident. But now I'd really like to know more about
Yeah.
that. Um,
Yeah.
But who?
Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing that story. That's
Sure. No, I have to admit that like one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is, you know, how to think about like you know, the environmental aspects
yeah.
of the
Mhm.
Godzilla franchise. I mean, it's in there in a lot of movies, but and it's a message that takes kind of subtly different forms in different movies. But
Yeah, they're very
yeah,
vocal about
I'm
it in a lot of them. In some, it's much more subtle. But
right.
I agree. It's about, science is
Yeah.
good, unfettered science. You have to be very careful about, you know,
Right.
respect the environment, or it's going to come back around on you. You know, don't destroy
Right.
the world that we're living on. Yeah, I mean, it's that message is there through
Right.
the series, and it's I think it's like, you know,
Yeah.
great things about it. You know,
Yeah, definitely. And it's one of the, you know, Godzilla just seems to be such a useful vehicle for so many people, like across the years, to talk about their own specific, you know, message, their own specific idea. You know, the monster himself is dual-sided to begin with, and he's both a victim as well as a victimizer. And so, you know, that kind of ambiguity, I think,
yeah,
allows for lots of different possibilities. And I love one of the reasons that like the whole kaiju thing is so interesting to me is because of that, you know, the way that people use these kind of stories to talk about you know, the things that are really important to them.
I would say when you first started talking, at the start of this interview, you mentioned about being in Japan during the disaster, and then coming back and doing this course about relating to disasters and how it led you back to Godzilla. And then you have Shin Godzilla, which is directly connected to the disaster that motivated you in the first place. It's a very interesting kind of full circle. Um, was the film wasn't out before you came back, right? I assume you were back in America working on your
Yeah.
project,
So
your course before it came out.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. So
Mm.
when I was taught the first iteration of this disaster in modern Japan class. Shin Godzilla wasn't out yet. And so, but as soon as it came out, I was like, and I watched it, I'm like, oh my God, of course, what a
You had the
beautiful
equivalent of
pairing
a
this
54
makes.
Japanese audience basically seeing Godzilla
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
first time. It's
Right, right. And so for a number of years I paired the 1954 Godzilla. I would introduce that fairly early in the class, and then we'd do Shin Godzilla, Shin Godzilla later, and yeah, and then I would have them write a comparison paper about how were the messages changed. And yeah, I think students really enjoyed it, and it's fun. I think that Godzilla is really a fantastic way to as you guys have pointed
Huh?
out, to get people thinking about the messages that are hidden behind our pop culture icons. There's always something going on there.
yeah, you start maybe watching it because you like dinosaurs or something, and then you realize there's so
Right.
much
Wait,
more
I'm
there.
learning something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, damn it, they're
Yeah.
teaching me something. What's up with that?
Right. Yeah. No, I certainly wasn't aware of this when I was watching these movies a long time ago and stomping around my living room,
Exactly.
like stomping on little boxes, pretending to be Godzilla.
So that's
And I
amazing.
think that's kind of what attracted me to the Godzilla films growing up. Because yeah, I watched all different types of monster
Uh-huh.
movies growing up, and the Japanese
Uh-huh.
films. And obviously, the landscape's different. You got Mount Fuji and all. You've got the architecture is different. It's almost like a whole different world. Whereas the American
Yeah.
monsters, unless you go back to like the Universal monsters in Transylvania or something, it's all pretty
Hmm.
pedestrian. It's like you recognize everything, but
Hmm.
the Japanese films,
Right.
everything just looks so totally different. It's kind of more stylized.
Right. Right. Yeah. As a kid, I have to say that I was really attracted to the kind of very mid-century modernness of a lot
Mhm.
of the Toho
Mm.
Showa era films. The kind of very sleek 1950s looking interiors, and
Right.
the colors and everything like that. And I was born in 1971, and so that was a full generation before me, and so that kind of sleek mid-century modernness was already going out by the time I was a kid in the early 1980s. So yeah, it was a whole different kind of aesthetic.
Yeah, the films have a great look. Just
Yeah.
seeing that world.
Mhm.
I mean, like I said, even just the real shots of real Japan. You know,
Yeah.
it's a very interesting. And then you throw in the fantasy elements and the way like Honda and Subaru would create these worlds, and it's very eye catching. I guess
Yeah.
is very. It
And
draws.
just
Yeah.
watching Godzilla raids again last night. Again, that's not a film that I watch a lot, but
Mhm.
I was struck by how good the miniatures are in that.
Mm.
The quality of the miniatures, especially Osaka Castle. But that's kind of like a
Mhm.
centerpiece of it. But
Mhm.
a lot of the other buildings and things, because they destroy a lot of buildings in that fight.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, there's a
Definitely.
lot of details in all those miniatures.
Yeah. This summer, after I had submitted the draft of my translation, after I'd submitted it to the press, and it was in their hands, I went to Osaka, and so I made a special effort to go and look at the police building,
Specific
that's
building.
right next to yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
to make sure that that I took lots of photographs of the interior, just to kind of get it back in my
Mhm.
imagination. And then later on, when I rewatched the film, it was really interesting to see how accurate,
Yeah.
not just Osaka Castle, but all the neighboring buildings were. I
Yeah.
mean, they really did a great job of reproducing them. I keep on getting a message saying my internet connection is unstable. Uh,
Oh,
I'm not sure why this is happening. I can hear you now.
oh,
All right,
Can
we
you
can
hear me
see you
now?
now too. So, do you want just because if it's going to be a recurring issue, do you want to just um, give a closing statement? I guess.
Yeah, I'd love it if some interested kaiju fans out the book. It's going to be hitting bookshelves in bookstores on October 3rd, 2023. And yeah, it's already there on Amazon for pre-order. And I think I've heard rumors that copies are already beginning to go out. So I hope that some fellow Godzilla lovers out there will pick it up. You'll see a different side of Godzilla in it, I promise.
Can they go maybe if they go straight to the publisher, that's where issues are starting to come out?
You can purchase it directly from the publisher, I know. I'm not sure which would be the fastest way to get a copy of it, but yeah, I think within about 2 weeks they should be everywhere.
Great.
I'll also say too that when we post this video, we'll include ordering links for Amazon for the publisher. If there's anyone else you want us to do, just send it to me. I'll make sure we include it in our notations. And just spread the word.
Great.
And then also want to let our viewers know, it might already have started by the time this video posts, but we'll be doing a giveaway contest with for 5 signed copies. Thanks to the publisher and thanks to Heather Skinner for setting it up. And
yes,
so that'll be on the site probably Monday, Tuesday this coming week, which will be probably a few days in the past by the time the video posts. But anyway, just visit the site, please sign up, and we'll sign up for the contest, and we'll be sending out some nice signed copies to some people. So the book is absolutely worth getting. Having read it, I can confirm that 100%. If you're a longtime Godzilla fan,
thank you.
You're going to learn a lot. And I want to say too, not just the translations, but the little note you did about like names of places and things that have changed, and in the back about the bio of Kayama, and also your notes about how you went about translating it. I thought were really illuminating about explaining why Tsukiki is so important and what Kayama's views were. I really think that adds a lot to the book. So just across the board, I thought.
Oh, fantastic!
So,
fantastic!
Maybe the radio.
Thank you so much.
Definitely, thanks for coming on. And
I think that'd be fun to do the radio drama.
Yeah. No, thanks for coming on. And
absolutely. Thank you, gentlemen, for having me. Yeah. This has been a great deal of fun. I love to share all my passion for this project with people who love Godzilla and know even more about it than I do. So thank you so much.
There's a lot of passion out there, I tell you. But everyone should go and buy the book, read the book, and then go back and watch.
I'm sensing that. I love it.
It'll be great.
So thank you again, Jeffrey. I really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Oh, it's my pleasure. My pleasure.